Dear old work platform, it's not you, it's us. Actually, it is you. Endless onboarding? Constant IT bottlenecks? We've had enough. We need a platform that just gets us. And to be honest, we've met someone new. They're called Monday.com, and it was love at first onboarding. Their beautiful dashboards, their customizable workflows got us floating on a digital cloud 9. So no hard feelings, but we're moving on. Monday.com, the first work platform you'll love to use.
Welcome to No One Told Us, the podcast that tells the truth about parenting and talks about all the stuff you wish you knew before having kids. I'm your host, Rachael Shepard-Ohta, and today I'm so excited to speak with Tracy Cassels. Tracy is the director of Evolutionary Parenting, a resource that she founded in 2011 after the birth of her daughter. She has a BA in Cognitive Science from the University of California, Berkeley, an MA in Clinical Psychology from the University of British Columbia, and a PhD in Developmental Psychology, also from the University of British Columbia. Her academic works have been published in peer-reviewed journals, including Psychological Assessment, Personality and Individual Differences, Midwifery, and more. And she has previously worked in the nonprofit sector in agencies focused on education and social emotional development. And I've been actually just kind of a personal fan of your work for so long. I love your podcast and your blog. You have just so many amazing resources for parents that I appreciate so much in a world with so much misinformation and scary information. So I'm always directing people to read your blogs and listen to your podcast, especially on topics of things like sleep training and bed sharing and orchid children. And we'll kind of try to cover all of that today. But Tracy, just welcome to the podcast and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here. So I appreciate the chance to get to chat.
Yeah, me too. And it's actually so funny to hear your voice because, like I said, I listen to your podcast and I'm just used to hearing you talk. And so the back and forth will actually be nice this time. Kind of before we dive into all of the questions I have for you, I would love for you to just kind of tell us a little bit more about how you kind of got into this specialty. Like, what was it that made this particular or these particular topics that you discuss so frequently, like sleep and attachment and those things, what made those so interesting to you?
So I don't think it was that the topics themselves stood out more than any other, I think, parenting topic. I think for me, what it was at a personal level was that after my daughter was born, you all get inundated with information, as I'm sure you know, and you said misinformation. Mm-hmm. And I got it from all sides, right? And the first part for me wasn't even actually as an academic. It was my own experience growing up. So my mom raised us probably at the time not quite in a societally normative way. We all breastfed till we self-weaned between, 3 and 4. And then although she didn't co-sleep with me, she eventually did a bit with my brother and then really full-time for a long time with my sister. And I'm much older, so I kind of witnessed these things going on. So they were really normative for me. And so when I had my daughter, I kind of had the expectation that, co-sleeping was something we were ready to do, extended breastfeeding, all this stuff. And so I went into it with that mindset and then was kind of shocked at how many people felt that my views and plans were insane, to say the least there. So that's when I started going back into looking at the research, because I was working on my PhD at the time. So you have access to all this literature. And although my PhD was on theory of mind in children, it wasn't pertaining to this. I'm like, okay, let me go see what's out there, because this doesn't mesh with what I learned in clinical when we were talking about attachment disorders, et cetera. None of this seems to make sense. And the more I dug in, the more frustrated I got at what was being said out there for people. It just felt so wrong that people are spouting this information as if it's gospel, and nothing was supporting it, right? Like, it wasn't like we suddenly had this wealth of literature, but even people trying to bring up the research they were bringing up was really poorly done, right? And I did a doctoral minor in statistics and in psychometrics. So you're studying, how well a study is conducted, How good is the methodology? How robust are the results? And that missing was just such a huge red flag to me, that these are people pushing a cultural agenda without real consideration for what's going on outside. So that's really what kind of brought up the interest, especially in sleep, which was kind of the big. Sleep and breastfeeding were the two big kind of first ones that I got into. Orchid children came a bit later, after having two orchid children. One definite, my daughter is a full blown, and my son is, as you realize, compared to others, but a bit less so compared to her. And when there weren't a lot of resources, I was finding other research that would talk about differential susceptibility. All these things are actually right in there, the terminology. But when I saw, the orchid child, it was like, yes, thank you, from the research perspective. But then you realize there's research and no practical information on how to help families with it. So you can read, oh, this is what they have, this is what they do, this is what we find. Okay, well, how do I take that in? And so being able to kind of take a bit of my clinical lens and apply it to this with the research was kind of my approach to how can I make something accessible for families so that they're able to take what can be a really challenging situation, not only make sense of it from an academic perspective, but then kind of what are some tips and tricks that they can actually make it perhaps a bit easier.
So yeah, and if nobody's heard the term orchid child before, it's also called high sensitivity. And if you have no idea what we're talking about, then maybe don't worry about it. But
you probably don't have an orchid child if that's the case.
I always say, like, if you think you have one, it's a pretty good chance you do.
Yeah.
But I love talking about that. So we will definitely save some time at the end to talk more about that. Before, though, we dive into that, I would love to kind of just broadly talk about something you just mentioned, which is the sleep and sleep training research, because I can speak for myself. I did a Ferber style sleep training program with my oldest 7 years ago because my pediatrician told me to. When I Googled, and this was before there were, lots more different points of view on social media, everything I Googled said, you have to do cry it out, you have to do sleep training. They're never going to be able to sleep independently unless you do it. There were these studies that people would point to that show, no harm. It doesn't affect attachment, all these things. So what can you tell us about that? And I know you have several episodes of your own podcast dedicated to this very topic. So if somebody wants like some real deep dives, go there. But what are your general takeaways of why are people still saying that these things are true? And B, is there any grain of truth to that claim that sleep training will not harm attachment?
So let me say I also have, if people get access to journals, I did write a journal with Jenny Rozier, and it was covering what actually does the research say when we look at the good studies. If we're actually pulling good studies, what do we find? Mm-hmm. But let's start with, I think the first question is, what is out there? And the quality of research where, especially 7 years ago, what we really saw was a lot of studies claiming sleep training, quote unquote, worked. And the problem with these is not that the studies didn't show that kids were supposedly sleeping better after being left, but it was the method of measurement being used. So in all of these studies, what they're doing is they take the family, they take them in, they say, okay, you leave your kid to cry, and then you tell us how many times your kid wakes up in a night. Well, if you leave your child to cry, eventually they do stop crying for you, even if they're waking up. Right? But if you don't know they're waking up, you're reporting, this is fantastic. My kid's sleeping through the night now, so I don't need to worry about anything. And so you can kind of say, okay, look, it's quote unquote working. But what all these studies also found, which was kind of a big red flag and probably should have been a lot earlier, is that the moment you start responding again at night, it goes back to how it was. They're suddenly waking 5-6 times a night and calling out to you, which tells us we're really dealing with something more Pavlovian, right? That this is a response. So you don't respond, okay, I'm staying quiet. As soon as you do, oh, good, I can get something. Let me respond in turn. So whether or not it was working was how you define working. Was the child actually sleeping? And that's really how I think I define it, because that's what people say, your kid will never sleep. Well, these kids weren't sleeping. We have no evidence that they were sleeping, right? We have evidence that they weren't waking their parents anymore. So that's that first piece. Now, more recently, there have been a couple studies that use actigraphy, right? And that's that method of assessing the movement to determine sleep-wake cycles. And they assess it along with sleep training. And the few studies that have done this do not find that children sleep any more than those who are not sleep trained. So you're actually not improving the sleep at all. So kids are not sleeping any better on average. It might be, I can't say every single child doesn't sleep. That's not a claim we can make. But research is not about one person. It's about what are we seeing as a trend. And the trend is that it's not helping with sleep. So that's the first part we have to kind of debunk and say, you're not helping children sleep, but you are helping parents sleep, which gets to kind of that point of why is it still so popular? Why is it still out there? Because, and I'll talk about that in a minute a bit more, because I don't think it's just about parent sleep. But then the second piece is the attachment. And they did, after a while, start studying attachment. The problem is the methods used to study attachment are often parent report. So what you're assessing is a parent's attachment to the child or the parental impression of the child's attachment to them. It's not actually an objective measure of attachment. Right? So there's kind of a question there. Now, I've also raised a separate question elsewhere that maybe it's not about attachment, right? Like we always worry about attachment. And I had the great discussion with this with Levita D'Souza, who's a researcher and attachment researcher, where, we point out that if you look at cultures that co-sleep all the time and don't sleep train, 100% of kids are not securely attached, right? Like attachment is so much bigger. Where I think conversation should be shifted to is what's happening to a child's sense of stress, right? Like what are we doing when you talk about kind of early trauma? And early trauma is a big thing. I'm not saying every child that has endured trauma, because it depends on the responsiveness afterward, how supportive, all this other stuff that goes into it. But we raise the risk for trauma with it. And I think with some kids, especially when we talk about orchid children and everything, there's a much higher risk, right? When we see their stress reactions to certain events in studies, when they're supported, they don't show high stress. When they're not supported, i.e. left alone and not in the arms of a caregiver, their stress actually skyrockets. And these are not being left alone in a crib. This is kind of usually often like as minor as getting a shot, right? Like they're just getting their vaccination, whether they're held by a parent or not. And that's the kind of stress we see this huge effect on. And so I think that's more of the question at play. And there really isn't much at all on that. I've done 2 kind of series of trainings through Breastfeeding Conferences Australia. The one looking at the full research on the safety of sleep training, and then the second on sleep training and the stress response. And they're both, the research on one is fine. It's there. The one on stress, I will admit, it's kind of like a circumstantial case, right? If you're kind of building, what do we need to look at? Because no one's looked at it directly. We don't have that exact. But my hope is through looking at this and reading this, maybe someone will say, hey, maybe that's actually something we should start to take a look at. So I think that's the piece that really is there outside of that. But why do we keep pushing it? I'll be honest, parents get sleep, but also we live in a culture that really looks down upon things like co-sleeping, or bed sharing in particular, things that actually do help families get sleep. We have a very parent-centric view and a very separatist view of children and parents in our culture, right? It's taken a while to just get even baby wearing back into the norm, right? For the longest time, as soon as you had a stroller, separate yourself, put the child in there and push them around. Not saying strollers aren't amazing, but the fact that that was the only means to really do it says a lot about who we are as a society. So I think because we don't want to offer families answers that somehow might make them have to be a bit more tethered to their child, a bit more responsive to their child, it's just not a popular view. And although I'll argue that I think if we made that more socially acceptable, many families might come to it on their own without ever worrying about their kids' sleep, right? Because I think that's the secondary problem here is, and I think the secondary becomes almost primary. What we get from this culture of sleep training is that families are worried sick about their child's development due to their sleep. I have had so many families worry their child's going to basically end up homeless living under a bridge because they didn't sleep at 6 months of age. Yeah. And it's so unfair because that has nothing to do with how well your child is going to do in life, how their mental health is going to be. If anything, I think their mental health is stronger when you have that close bond and you're attached and you're responsive and you're being there for them. So sleep should not be the number one concern of families. And I think the fact that it is just speaks to what a non-family friendly society we actually have.
100%. I have a couple questions about what you just said. We're going to take a quick break and then we'll be right back.
Work management platforms. Ugh, endless onboarding, IT bottlenecks, admin requests. But what if things were different?
We found love in an open space.
Monday.com is different. No lengthy onboarding. Beautiful reports in minutes. Custom workflows you can build on your own. Easy to use prompt-free AI. Turns out you can love a work management platform. Monday.com, the first work platform you'll love to use.
I don't know about you guys, but I have an actually insane spring and summer. I have so much travel. We have so many things going on. Our kids are in all these activities for the spring with sports and everything. So it just makes it really hard to make a great, delicious home-cooked dinner for my husband and I every single night, which is why I love Factor. You can also make this your best season yet with these nutritious 2-minute meals from Factor. They're so easy. They're fresh, delicious. Pop them in the microwave and they are ready to go. Restaurant quality taste, I swear. So with 45 weekly menu options, you'll truly never get bored, and you can always pick something that works for not just your lifestyle, but your nutritional needs and goals as well. Factor also powers your day with satisfying breakfasts, on-the-go lunches, along with their premium, delicious dinners, but they also have guilt-free snacks and desserts. So you can truly fit Factor into your lifestyle no matter what. We love having them delivered right when we get home from a vacation, especially. I have it all set up to be delivered right when we get back from Mexico because I know I'm not going to have time to shop or cook. And it just makes it so easy knowing that we have a really yummy dinner. My husband always looks forward to them. He's always asking when we're getting our next box. So just do yourself a favor and order Factor, especially because I have an amazing code for you. So you can get started at factormeals.com/no-one-told-us-50 off and use code no-one-told-us-50 off to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. So that's code no-one-told-us-50 off at factormeals.com/no-one-told-us-50 off to get 50% off plus free shipping on your Factor meal order. We're back, and you were just talking, Tracy, about sleep training and parent report. What do you make of, we kind of do know that sleep training doesn't actually improve infant sleep all that much. So what do you make of parents who have done it, who say their kid is so much more well-rested, their kid is so much happier? Is that, I mean, I don't want to say, is that true? Because I don't think that these parents are lying or have like malicious intent to share that. And I'm glad that that's their experience and perception. But what do you make of that? Is there a reason that parents are seeing that?
Absolutely. You see it because you're the one that's happier. So we can talk about two things. One, rose-colored glasses. If I'm well rested and I'm feeling better, I look at my baby in a whole new way, right? Yeah. The same behaviors one day when I'm tired, you're angry, you're whatever, because I am. Mm-hmm. Whereas when I feel better, I can see behaviors in a totally different way. The other thing is that if I'm well rested, I'm actually likely bonding a bit better with my child, right? I might be more engaged. I might be able to be more responsive. And that is an argument that I hear for sleep training. If it makes a parent more responsive, my counter to that, just to be clear, is that there are other ways of getting sleep to allow you to feel that way and allow you to respond that don't involve putting that burden of your sleep on your child, right? That is kind of where I go, is that there's so many other ways to do this, and that's what's not being talked about. And I've heard of, the most extreme cases where people say, my baby was waking 20 times a night. Well, let me be clear, something's wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're ignoring that something's wrong,
a problem.
Right?
That's not normal. Yeah.
There is, and I've worked with families with that. And we've worked to find the caregivers and identify who needs to be involved to solve that problem. And So we can't be normalizing this behavior and saying, oh, it's all because you need to sleep train.
Right.
I think one of the worst things I ever heard was a mother who approached her GP, to get a referral for psychological help. She was really down, struggling postpartum, etc. The doctor refused to give it unless she sleep trained. And it
Can't
was
even tell you how many times I've heard that.
like, it
It's
is
so
disgusting.
insane.
Like,
So
the
insane.
two are, even if sleep was part of the problem,
Yeah.
you have someone in mental health crisis. That person needs someone right away, and you
Yep.
need to be able to get them that help. So it's infuriating what goes on here. But yeah, so I think there's absolutely a reason why, people feel that way about their kids. And it is twofold. And I'm not saying it can't improve bonding if you're rested. It's how do you get that rest? That's, I think, at the crux of the issue there.
And so can you just talk a little bit about, because we talked about attachment a little bit, and I agree with you. I think attachment, it's so multifactorial. Like, one decision in your parenting is very unlikely to cause a rupture in your attachment that can't be repaired unless, the caveat to that I would say is when you're having to repeat the sleep training over and over and over again, and then it kind of becomes a pattern in care where you're intentionally miscuing, that can be a little bit of a problem. But can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean when you talk about the stress response, and what are the risks that we run when we're sleep training to our child's stress response?
So I don't know how many know, but we have what's called the ACEs, which are the adverse childhood events. And they're usually set for a bit older kids. They don't really cover infancy, to be perfectly honest. They're things like divorce, drug use amongst parents, abuse, things like that. So they're pretty heavy things. But we know that the more a child has, the higher the risk of later mental health problems, poor outcomes, etc. And it's not because they can affect attachment, absolutely. But it's really because of the stress they put on the system to experience these, right? So we're designed to handle a certain amount of stress, right? We have our threshold that you go up. And when you work within that threshold, okay, you recalibrate, you come down. But when you get too high or even too low, which can happen after a strong stressor, you get out of balance. And what eventually happens is that threshold actually shrinks. So you're constantly going too high, too low, too high, too low. And that has negative health problems. There's a great book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by Robert Splint. Again, names I can't pronounce here, but hold on. How am I supposed to pronounce that? Sapolsky. Sorry. So there's a great book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by Robert Sapolsky. And he talks about this stress response, how we've evolved differently, right? So our stress response is still quite primal in certain ways. And so things that we do in our culture, and he's talking often about adults, but like work stress, etc., our bodies aren't designed for that kind of stress, right? We're designed for stress that we can do something about. We get chased by something and we run. And part of that running actually is using all the adrenaline and getting rid of it so it doesn't sit in our body. Our kids experience stress too, and they're not supposed to experience a lot of stress, right? We always hear kids are resilient, and it drives me nuts because they are to a certain degree, but actually they're kind of less resilient than us, if we're quite honest. They should be less resilient than us. I think a lot of us aren't because of our own upbringings, right? So we don't handle things quite as well. But when you have this stress, you're creating a stress response that becomes more and more triggered. So we know too much stress is bad. The more stress you experience in life, actually you become hypersensitive to stress. So you start to experience it at the smallest hint of a problem. You don't need a big problem anymore. It's just almost right there. And then eventually your cortisol response becomes flattened. So it basically, you stop producing enough cortisol. And most of us could think that's good, except cortisol is really central to how our body functions. So if you're even too low, you're not functioning physically in a good way. And these are kind of that precursors to these negative physical outcomes as well as mental health outcomes, right? Because we're always on edge. Our body isn't working properly. It affects our sleep. It affects our circadian rhythm. All these things go. So stress is bad. Right? Let's just go with it. Too much stress. Some stress is good. Minor stress is good. But some stress, too much is bad. But babies, what stresses babies? Right? Is it divorce? we know abuse does for sure. And there's someone finally developed the infant ACEs. And it was the idea of, okay, what are the things that would stress a baby when we look at the research here? And the biggest things for babies are separation from a caregiver, being alone for periods of time, abuse, obviously. But basically, it's these things that go against what we can say we biologically expect, right? If we think about we are primates, and if you go and look at your chimpanzees, your gorillas, etc., you look at how they parent. Their children are very close, especially as babies. They latch on and they go for the ride and they come around and nurse and then they come back. And there are other people that help care and they move them around. That's the kind of expectation that children have. So these things that violate those expectations are almost like these infant ACEs, right? They're these things that take them away because it's so primal as to what they expect. Their brain isn't developed to be like, yes, mom needs sleep. I better lie here quietly, but I'm in a safe house. This is good. No, this baby has instincts that think they could get eaten by wolves. And so they're looking for someone to take care of them at a primal level. And it's not saying they consciously think they're going to get eaten by a wolf, but those are how our instincts keep us alive, right? I better make sure someone's near me. Because if someone's near me, they're going to protect me. And they're going to keep me safe. And we even see that through the lens of co-regulation, right? So when our infants are upset and we're just looking at them, we can't co-regulate as well as if they're touching our skin and hearing our heartbeat. And if we're calm, we're actually bringing their cortisol levels right down, right? So that's that research piece where we see that as kids are supported, oftentimes it is really hard to elicit a cortisol response. So when we do studies with children and you need to elicit a cortisol response, you separate them from their parent. And that's how you get that cortisol response.
I just got goosebumps when you said that. And I want to talk more about this one piece that you were just talking about too, because I think so many parents come into parenthood, I know I did, thinking, oh, I'll just put the baby down in their cute bassinet and that's where they'll sleep. And, I'll just swaddle them and put them down drowsy but awake and then they'll sleep. And then parents are really shocked to find that lots of babies don't like that. Lots of babies want to be held and cuddled and they want to sleep on your body and they want to be latched and they're not going to do very well with being put down. And I think what you were just talking about really just highlights that separation piece it's just what they're biologically meant to do.
But it's also, if you have a baby that is fine being put down, that's okay too.
Right? Yeah,
There's
totally.
These differences in terms of regulation. Some kids are actually just better regulating right at birth. That's kind of that orchid dandelion distinction here.
Yes.
Some really are just better at that right from the get-go. And I hate to say it, it's not that you're the best parent in the world. Wait till you have a second that isn't that.
They'll humble you, yeah.
It does happen. And it's not that there's anything wrong with your child either. I've heard people worried that, well, how come my kid's fine sitting down away from me? And it's like, because they're comfortable.
Yes.
There you go. You don't need to stress that your kid, having a child that needs to be attached to you does not speak in one way or the other about that attachment. It speaks to that child's regulatory needs.
And their temperament. And another piece that I wish it was essential reading or an essential course or something that all parents had to take before they had their first baby is temperament. And I would love to talk to you about that for a little bit when we come back. So we're back with Tracy Cassels, and we have been talking a lot about sleep training and sleep training research. And I talked a little bit with you about how I tried it with my first and it never worked. And lo and behold, he is my orchid baby. And no wonder it didn't work.
Yes.
Like now I'm like, duh. But I didn't know about temperament back then. I was a new mom. I didn't know anything. And I wish that I could go back and do things so differently knowing what I know now. And I know you have an orchid child or two yourself. You do lots of great work around temperament and teaching parents what orchids are like and what they need. Can you tell us a little bit about, first, what is an orchid child or a highly sensitive child? What are those traits that we look for? And then why would something like sleep training not be a good fit for them?
That's a great question. Yeah. So an orchid child or the highly sensitive child, which are overlapping but not quite fully overlapped, right? But for all intents and purposes, they're the same. They are the children who are much more sensitive to their environment. So they, due to that sensitivity, they also they're lower in regulatory abilities. They tend to find life a bit more overwhelming. So they tend to be a bit more particular, especially as they get older. And they tend to require much more support from us. And you may have noticed, you said yours is 7 now. I always say the hardest ages for an orchid are actually that kind of 4 to 8 age, because it's where a lot of differences start to come up. So what you start to look for, especially in the younger ages, are infants that are very clingy. They really need to be attached to their parent. They don't like being put down. They like to sleep on them. And again, that's that regulatory piece, right? If you don't regulate yourself, and you think about physiologically, they might struggle to regulate their temperature better, their heart rate, their breathing, etc. You want to be close to someone that does that for you. So they need that proximity, and they struggle when they get put down. And sometimes parents just need to know that it's okay that you have a baby that needs to be held that much. I mean, my daughter lived on me. I look at the research, and honestly, I think she probably is a huge outlier, that I don't think she spent more than 2% of her time out of arms. Like, we bed shared. It was like, so whether it was my arms, my husband's arms, but I mean out of arms of people, right? She was always kind of in that and needed that. Then as they get older, you find that there also might be some like sensory sensitivities that go along, which can also help explain some of that regulatory piece too. So they might dislike smells or certain sounds or touch certain materials. And these are all things we don't know and babies can't speak to us about, right? So they're constantly looking for us to support them. They might be a bit fussier because of those things. And it takes us time to know all this to get there. And then, of course, you hit that age 4 to 8 kind of period where I say it's so hard, because that's where you start seeing a ton of independence in other kids. And orchids can be very independent when they're in that perfect environment for them, right? So one of the things about an orchid, and I'll just, for those that don't know the term, it was termed an orchid because if you, and I knew nothing about orchids, the flowers, before this, so I actually learned about flowers through my children. If you have an orchid flower, it has to have the perfect environment for it to thrive. It's not perfect in terms of like, there's never anything wrong with it, right? It might not rain long enough, but you need it, it has to be in that exact spot. And I had Lindsay Hookway, who I love, gave a great example. She had an orchid when we were talking together one time. She had an orchid growing up, and someone moved it like 2 feet and it died. Right? Same room, same everything. It's not that 2 feet away was this horrible environment, but it wasn't exactly what that orchid needed. So what we see with orchids are these kids that unfortunately can have, depending on their upbringing, right? They're really sensitive to their parenting and the environment around them. When they have the right environment for them, and it's the right environment for them, there isn't a perfect one. No two orchids are the same, but that right environment for them, they thrive and they are the orchid, right? This beautiful, astounding, they grow to be amazing. They often have fewer health problems, fewer mental health problems grown up, right? We're talking about the long term here. But when they don't have that right environment, and it doesn't mean it's a bad environment, we're not talking about abuse or anything like that. But when they don't have the right environment, they tend to struggle a lot more. They suffer from more mental health disorders. They suffer from health problems later on. And of course, the worse that environment is, they do even worse, right? So if you do start throwing in things like abuse, they're going to struggle far more than others will. And all the way along to the other end of the spectrum are what we call the dandelions. And they're the people who kind of like a dandelion outside of those extremes. You don't see dandelions in the Arctic. But outside of those extremes, they can pretty much grow and do well wherever they're at, right? So you kind of put them anywhere and they're like, I'll be fine. I'm good. Mm-hmm. So they can withstand a bit more. You talk about that resiliency. They're just kind of inherently more resilient to the world around them, okay? Mm-hmm. So that's really the difference between the two. And so at that age 4-ish, I always find that's where you really see that divergence, right? Because the dandelion and along the spectrum up, they're just going to be a bit more adventurous. They're going to be a bit more out there. They're going to be a bit more confident. And our orchids in the perfect environment for them can be exactly like that. So you often see glimpses of exactly what they can be. And then you switch the environment up and suddenly they are struggling. They're clingy, they're having difficulty accepting everything. It just becomes a much harder environment, and you're just going, oh my God, and you've got to process everything with them and work through with them and do all this kind of stuff to make it better for them. And I always find that I think the more we can work with them, we're giving them that toolbox that they use as they get older, right? So when they do reach adulthood, our dandelions have a little toolbox because they probably only need a little toolbox most of the time. Our orchids are carting like a van or a truck filled with tools that they can take for all these different scenarios that they've experienced and have to be able to deal with and address. And I think that's what gives them those better outcomes, because they face those problems and they actually have the capacity to handle them. And why they might even be better is that there are going to be some issues that dandelions and orchids face that dandelions are like, I don't have a clue how to deal with this. And the orchid's like, got it right here. I know this. I've got this tool right over there. Let me go get it. And that really allows them to kind of thrive in that better space.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so encouraging too, as just if any parents are listening and they think they might have a highly sensitive child or an orchid child, I think it is so heartening to know that just with your sensitive caregiving, you could be doing just such amazing things for your child and helping them reach their full potential someday. Because I know it can be hard. It's also really hard to have a child that is highly sensitive. Or just back to the sleep training for a second, like those kids are just not going to take as well to it as an easygoing kid. And that doesn't mean that, like, when I failed at sleep training, I thought it was because we had messed it up. There was something wrong with our kid. And I just kept being told, I was being like gaslighted constantly, like, oh, well, you just must have not been consistent enough, or, oh, you just didn't do it right, or, you know, oh, did you try it this way? And I just was like, yes, I tried everything. Like, it's not working the way everyone says it should. And there was nothing wrong with us. It was just, it would have never worked for him because of his temperament. And there are so many other kids like that.
And just to add to that, sorry, because I forgot to address the sleep training, but part of why it's so hard for kids who are orchids is that regulatory piece. What you're asking a child to do is regulate themselves in bed, to get to not cry, to stay calm, to fall asleep. And sometimes even when they don't cry, it doesn't mean they're not stressed. And that's that hard piece, right? And we see it in other forms of research that actually assess, you know, when kids are quiet and you look at different temperaments, and sometimes they look very obedient. And this was actually, I always kind of, in part of my circumstantial case, I go back to when we first started discovering kind of that anxious avoidant attachment. It was the kids that actually they thought for the longest time were actually doing great. Right? The parent leaves. So in the attachment scenarios that we give in research is a parent leaves the room and the kid gets upset. And after a while, then, you know, usually a stranger comes in first, then a parent comes back, and the child, a securely attached child, will be upset when their parent leaves, but also will welcome them back. They might be a little upset that they've been gone, but they go and they welcome them. That resistant child, which they used to see, would fight them. They would be angry. There would be this resistance and anger going against them. And then for the longest time, there was this other subset of kids that really just kind of sat there and were like, okay, like whatever. And they thought they were totally cool until they started measuring their cortisol levels and their stress levels while they were sitting there. And these were the kids whose stress was through the roof, but they weren't expressing it. They just sat there quietly engaging, and that was it. They didn't offer, you know, there was nothing that helped them through that. So that was kind of that piece. When I think about that, we think we know what children are experiencing when they're quiet. And sometimes some kids are quiet and they're just totally happy and quiet, but we don't know. And especially when they're too young to speak up, we really don't know. And so I think we always should err on the side of caution with that, of just kind of wondering, like, okay, how are you really doing? And let's see. And that's always my test. I always say to families, if you've sleep trained, go back and be responsive again. That will tell you how well your kid took it. If your kid truly is, miraculously, they are sleeping through the night, and that's really what development they hit during that period, You bringing them closer or, when they're sick, taking care of them and stuff should lead to them going right back to doing it again, right? But if it doesn't, the chances are that isn't really what happened. That is not what they learned. They didn't learn I can sleep. They learned how to stay quiet.
The last thing that I would love to talk about before we wrap up is bed sharing, because you mentioned that you saw bed sharing growing up. It was very normalized for you. You bed shared with yours and same. And I think a lot of people listening probably same, or they're at least curious about it, or they're like, oh my God, I didn't know this was an option. Tell me more. Because I think sometimes we don't even think about it as an option because it's so like demonized in our culture. We just think, oh, never going to do that. Like, I'm not one of those freaky attachment parents. That's not me. What can you tell us about what made you feel comfortable with bed sharing? Because there is so much fear mongering about the risks.
So part of it for me was, if you research globally around the world, a lot of cultures bed share. They do not have heightened SIDS risk, all this other stuff that goes along. So let's be clear, like, there are factors in our culture that make it somewhat more dangerous. We have soft beds, we have high beds, we have more people that drink and smoke and do all that stuff that affects things. So for me being comfortable, I still had all those concerns, right? Of looking at the environment. For me, it was, okay, so our bed went down to the floor, right? No box spring, no nothing. We're down low. Ensuring that my child, I would have one sheet that would go up to, my waist, and my daughter was lying on top of it, not under any blankets. I had a small pillow at the beginning instead of the big one so that she couldn't roll into it. And of course I knew, because she was breastfeeding, she was always positioned lower than that to be able to, so that I could just roll over, pop a boob in, and then be done, right? So that helped, which we know that's how balls work, which is so great about the positioning when you breastfeed versus not. And it doesn't mean you can't bed share if you're not breastfeeding. It just means we have to be a bit more aware of it, right? So when you look at the environment that you create and being intentional about it, that's one of the other things in research we forget. In some of the research where they've kind of followed up with people, intentional bed sharing did not increase a risk of SIDS. It was the unintentional. And it's because that unintentional is where things go wrong. And so you hear the stories, and they're heartbreaking, of women who are like, I will not bed share, but my baby's asleep next to me in this cot, right? So I have to stay awake when I breastfeed. I sit up and I get my baby, and then I fell asleep. And you're in one of the worst positions. They're cradled in, they can get stuck in. You might move over some way, and the baby can't move to get out. Whereas, so that unintentional nature of it is just so, that's the danger. So I always, when I work with families, I would always say, look, whether you plan to or not, just look at the environment. James McKenna has a wonderful book on just how to, it's a tiny little guide. You can get the tiny guide, just the guide. Yeah, you got, there you go. Right,
always
there.
On my desk. Here it is. Safe infant sleep.
It's, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And you can just follow how to do it. And I'm like, just set your, if, and you don't mean to, but you do bed share. That one night you're exhausted, you're up, your baby's sick and been up for however many times, and you're struggling. You've taken the precautions that you're there. The other thing, knowing the research, it sounds like a really hard question to ask, but I know someone who lost a child to sudden unexplained death of an infant. And I always took a bit of heart in that her answer to it was, I'm heartbroken, but she knew the research too. There was no, and in fact, at the time he died, she wasn't even in bed with him. Like, he was a bit older and he just happened to die overnight. She wasn't in the bed. It wasn't like, even though she would have gotten into the bed later, that's what led to her being aware of it. But I know spent entire life with that closeness, that proximity, that warmth, that we had all of that time. Touching, bonding, everything, that I know he felt that love from it, because we do spend a lot of time in bed, and babies in particular. And if you think about, if you think that you're not touching someone for that long at that young age, like, that touch is a good stimulation of the system for development and everything. So you get a ton of that when you're bed sharing, right? You get that proximity. And I know families who, I mean, I'm in Canada, we get a year's maternity leave. Not many people in the US get that. So I've had a lot of families that really relish that time at night because they might be gone during the day. And they said, if I didn't bed share, how much time would I actually be with my child? And knowing that when they're young, that time still sleeping is crucial for bonding. They're smelling you, they're adjusting to your heart rate, they're doing all those things. So it's providing another bonding period and a chance to be responsive at night, right? You wake up, I feed you, whether it's breast or bottle, we snuggle, we get back to sleep. It really does create something that can be harder when you have to be at work all day. So I think there's a lot of ways in which it really benefits families. But again, that risk and, the demonization in our society is I hate, and we did a podcast episode on it, but also an article, Jenny Roger and I again, on the history of how we got to sleep training and everything. And it's infuriating. If you want to be angry, you can read it and listen. If
you want to rile yourself up,
there you go. It's there.
I know.
But that's it. I think that you just have to make sure it's safe. And so I always caution families and it's not too late now. If your baby's 3 months old, 6 months old, a year old, and you want to give it a shot now, there is no too late, right? The only way it's too late is if you think you're going to be able to do it and say, we'll do this for 3 months and that's it. Because that's confusing to a child too, right? Like, why are you suddenly here and I'm here, I'm gone, I'm not sure what's going on. So I think that's the one thing to look at. But other than that, there's no age at which you can't go back. And children will bed share for varying ages. You look at cultures around the world, and some kids get pushed out at 3 or 4 because new siblings come along, and then they go sleep with other siblings, right? So our actual shared
still not
sleep,
alone. Yeah.
Exactly, shared sleep is actually a huge universal for a lot of the world, right? It's kids sleep together and adults sleep together, and then. But in some cultures, it can go quite late. Like, there was one where girls tend to co-sleep till about age 12 with their mothers and boys till about age 8. And that's kind of the standard. So there's nothing odd about that. It might not be for every family. You might choose to, change that a bit earlier, but there's nothing strange about it. It's very biologically normal to want to sleep next to someone else.
I saw a post yesterday on Instagram about all the health benefits of sleeping next to someone you love and all of the regulatory benefits. And it was a picture of a couple sleeping together. And I just was like, why is this so normalized and celebrated for adults, but children are expected to sleep 12 hours in a room by themselves?
Exactly.
And it's not a shame thing. My kids sleep in their own rooms. That works for them. They don't mind it. My big kids share a room and they love that. But they also know that they're welcome to come in to sleep with us anytime they need. And as long as everybody's sleeping, I don't really care where everybody is, honestly. It just doesn't matter that much. And it's such a short time.
Yeah, exactly. And as you said, your two eldest share a room together.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, who knows how much sleep they're getting? They're probably having fun together for half the time, but they're enjoying and they're bonding from it.
Yes.
Kids who share a room too, siblings that share the room, often, really develop a close bond from that experience, as we might expect, right? They're spending all that extra time together. And sometimes it doesn't work. I've had friends, where their sleep schedules are so different and just their behaviors are different that it actually disrupts each other. So you do have to look at what works for your kid and what happens there. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, I know we could go on and on about all of this stuff, but luckily you have an amazing podcast as well. So if anybody wants to hear more from Dr. Tracy, please head over to the Evolutionary Parenting podcast. And the last question I have for you is, what is something no one told you before you became a parent?
Oh my goodness.
That you wish you had just known, or you wish you had been a little more prepared for?
See, it's hard. I was so involved with my mom and everything. It gets a little, I have to really think here because
you feel like you kind of knew. Yeah.
Oh my God. I babysat so many children. When I was 14, I was sent off to, I worked with a family as an au pair, and they left me for a week with a 3-month-old down at I had to get up in the middle. I had a 3-year-old and 3-month-old, and they stuck me down in a boathouse because it was up at their cottage. We're Canadian. Lots of people have cottages. I had to, in the middle of the night, multiple times a night, get up, walk the baby up to get the formula going and make the formula, heat it up and do it over the pan, like no microwave, and get it all ready, and then like feed the baby, and then march back down to the water
For an
and
entire
get back
week?
up
Oh my God.
for a week by myself. I was like, okay, but so I kind of went through
You
a
got
lot
it.
with
That was
kids.
your basic
And,
training.
so I had that, and I had, my younger sister's 14 years younger than I am, so we had a lot there. So I'm just trying to think.
But honestly, that's so amazing, and just speaks to another cultural piece that like most people are not raised around little children. And so when they become parents, it's like their first time ever holding a baby, or their first time ever feeding a baby. And like, that's, I think, a part of why it's so shocking to new parents in our culture to have a baby for the first time, because it's so foreign.
Exactly. And I think this actually gets to the one thing I wish I'd known, is that other people can just be assholes and it has nothing to do with you.
Oh my God,
Like,
preach.
they are, and you'd hear it and I'd just be like, what is going on? Like, they'd have so many opinions. And I guess because I grew up without that, there was, I watched kids of all different kinds, formula, solo sharing, bed sharing, this, that, like, it was just surrounded, and I spent a lot of time with kids. No one was really judgy and rude. And then you have a kid, and it was hard actually not to internalize it at first, because I was like, what is wrong? What's happening? So just know that when people give you shit, it is absolutely about them and not you. And I always would have to tell families after, as I got used to it, is like, they're not paying your bills. Let's be honest. Yeah. Like, no matter what happens, no matter how loud your baby is in a public space, no matter the dirty looks you might get for breastfeeding in public, none of those people are paying your bills. So forget them, like, quite simply.
That is the advice I think I definitely could use today, and all of us could use all the time, because you're right. Being on social media or not, the judgment is real. Tracy, thank you so much for joining us. If anyone's interested in your sleep modules offered through the breastfeeding conferences, they can find those in the show notes, and I will also link your Instagram and your podcast. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. You are such a wealth of knowledge on this stuff, and I absolutely love learning from you. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much again.